So today we will build a patch from scratch with the phase-driven sequencers from HetrickCV, which will sound like this. These sequencers are a part of a whole new series of modules in this collection dedicated to a unique way of clocking and driving sequencers, the Phasor collection. I have an in-depth video on my Patreon page where I go through all the modules in this collection, exploring and experimenting with various ideas. If you are interested, there's a link in the description to where you can find it. There are many more exclusive videos available there, together with a document full of patching techniques and ideas and other exclusive content. So already you can see that there are two versions available of this sequencer, right? And the main idea behind using a phasor signal is instead of clocking the sequencer with a pulse wave, where each pulse is a step, like I'm doing here with the Sec3, right? With the phasor, we have a continuous signal. You can see this here on the scope that will scan through the sequencer. This will work differently than a clock source, of course, and we can use all sorts of shapes and signals as a phasor signal. So let's really start with the patch and see how things work. So as always, I have the MindMeld mixer already set up. Of course, with the send reverb with plateau, and also here I will use color coding just so maybe it makes things easier to follow. Now there is a dedicated phasor generator module that will look like this, right? This will generate a phasor signal for us, but I highly recommend experimenting with other voltage sources and using them as phasor signals. Now we will start with a 16-step version of the sequencer that will look like this, right? I will drive it with a phasor. So here we have the phasor output. In this case, I will use a green cable and not blue because we are not clocking the sequencer. We are more or less modulating its position. So modulation is green, and already you can see that it's running. Right now, let's add a voice to this already so we can hear what's going on. I will put the phasor generator here. And let's add a voice. I will use the Sine VCO from Surge and also the envelope generator from Surge. We have left and right. Audio is red. And then again to the mixer. Right now, let's activate a few steps. So let's go with 1, 5, 11, let's say 13 and 15. Right, I will use the gates output to gate the envelope, right? So already we have some sound. I will use also a quantizer. You know that I like to have my sequences quantized. And now I will use the sample and hold output. Pitch will be yellow. The sample and hold output through the quantizer to the oscillator. Now the sample and hold output will make sure that there will be changes in values, in this case in pitch, only with the active steps, right? So only when there is an active step, only there will be actual change in pitch. So now I can start changing changing the notes. Can have a bit more release. If I just choose or use the steps output, right, you can see that the pitch will go down again. Also on the not active steps, this is why I'm using the sample and hold. Right, let's set a unison of 3 voices. Of course, add some reverb. Right, soon we'll add more variation and actually change this sequencer or this sequence quite a lot. But for now, let's mute this and add another voice. We will use KickAll from Befaco. I really like using it as a bass voice. We will use another sequencer, another 16-step sequence. Right, again, I will use the gates. So the gate will go and trigger the KickAll. Right, and I can already send this to another channel on the mixer. Right, we will drive this sequencer with the same phasor signal. Right, and already you can see, if you pay attention and look at the sequencers, you can already see that they are in sync, they are in phase. There is no need to reset anything because I'm using the same phasor signal, right? The sequences are in phase, right? And now something even more interesting is when we change the number of steps, we can create polyrhythms. So if, for example, we activate step 2, 4, and let's say 5, right? We have something like this. Already we have sound. Right, but I'm going to change this sequencer to have only 7 steps. Right, so now what happens is that the sequencers are still in sync, they are still in phase. The first step, if you pay attention, the first step will always play together. Right, but this sequencer, the second sequencer, will play slower. In the same time, the first sequencer runs through 16 steps, this one will run only through 7. But still they will start at the same time. The first step will play together because we are using the same phasor signal. So we get a polyrhythm, not a polymeter. We don't have different meters, we have 2 different rhythms. Right, so again, the first step will always play together, but the second sequencer will play only 7 steps in the same length that the other one plays 16 steps. So now let's change the sound of KickAll a bit. We can make this even brighter. And we can use the sample and hold output again. I'm using the sample and hold just so we have changes on the selected steps to control the decay, right? So let's bring step 2 up a bit. Right, and step 5 all the way. Right, we can add a nice chorus also to KickAll. This is something I'm doing a lot lately, just to add a bit more interest to the sound. Right, so for now the mix all the way up, more drive. Maybe add a bit of high pass. Right, and then take the mixer down. Something like this. Right, now by the way, I have KickAll by default tuned to 65.421 Hz, which is more or less the note C. So I have it tuned to the note C, so it will work with the other voices. Okay, now let's mute this for a second and go back and add more variation, right, to this first sequence. Right, so first of all, we can use walk from Bog Audio to add more, to add more variation to the feedback. Walk will basically output smooth random signals. Right, so if I send this to the modulation input, I can then click this button and then assign this modulation to the feedback. Right, just to have a bit more variation in the sound itself. Right, but we can add also more variation to the sequence, to the notes. Right, so if we use, for example, a sample and hold, I will use the super sample and hold from Count Modula. It has already built-in noise, so basically it will output random voltages. Right, I can trigger it with the same gates that I'm using from the sequencer, so with each step we will get a new random value. And now I will mix this here with the VCA mixer. I will mix the original pitch, right? So now we get the same together with the sample and hold. Now if I add this just like that, again with each step we get a new random signal, so basically we get a random sequence. Right, but since this mixer is also a VCA, I can use probability to bring this random voltage in and out and have it change the sequence only here and there. For this, we will use chances. This is also from Count Modula. with basically it will add probability to incoming gates. And if we set this to latch, we make sure that it will output longer gates, right? That will stay longer open. So I'm going to use the same gates from the sequencer and use, let's say, output A to open and close the VCA for the random signal. Right, so now we have random notes here and there. The sequence has a bit more variation to it, and it's not always random. Right, we can take this even a step further and send a copy of this voice after the envelope generator. We can send it, opalach, I destroyed here the mixer. So after the envelope generator, we can send it to another envelope generator, again, a copy of this voice, and then to a delay, and we can use, for example, Chronoblob 2, right, and then to the mixer. Right, and then I can use the same gates that I use with probability, the same signal here that I use to bring in the random notes. We can use this to open the second VCA here. So only when we get a new random note, we will send this voice also to the delay. So first of all, we take the delay all the way up, or the wet all the way up. We don't need again the dry signal. We can lower the delay time, change the left and right from one another, so we have a stereo delay. Right, and now use the gates from chances. Gates will be blue, right, to gate this envelope. Right, we can add some reverb to this. This will be channel 3. Right, so again, only when the VCA for the random notes will open, which means only when this Sine VCO will play random notes, only then this envelope will open and will send this voice to a send delay. Right, let's unmute the bass. We can call this SIC or SEC, and then the second channel will be bass, and then delay, just so later we know what channel is what. Right, so already we have a nice beginning to this patch. Okay, now I will mute everything and we will add another voice. This one will be a HiHat voice, adding another rhythmic layer. So we will use in this case the 32-step version of this phase-driven sequencer. Right, we will use the same phaser signal to drive it. Right, and again, everything is in sync, everything is in phase, just that the 32-step version will run twice as fast as the 16-step version. Right, again, it will play 32 steps at the same time that the 16 steps finishes a cycle. So here we have 16, here we have 32, and they will start always at the first step together. Right, so basically this sequencer, the 32-step one, will run twice as fast. We have more resolution. Now let's use noise with the dust module from HetrickCV. If we listen to this for a moment, we can create all sorts of densities of noise from vinyl, sort of crackle, all the way to quite a lot of noise. Right, so let's send this first through the VCV VCF, and I will use the high pass in this case. Right, the drive control we can use as a sort of a VCA. Right, so if I use an envelope, I will use the one from VCV to control the drive parameter here. Right, we can use the filter also as a sort of a VCA. Right, I can gate the envelope with, again, with the sequencer. For now, let's just set something simple. Right, something like this, make the envelope nice and snappy. Right, add more density, change the filter a bit. Right, let's unmute the other voices. Right, and now maybe we can add a few more steps, right? So if I add step 15, right, and the last 4 I can add sorts of ratcheting, right? Because again, in this case we have more resolution. We have 32 steps instead of 16, so we have more resolution, we can add more steps in between. Right, and now we can use again the sequencer itself, the values of the sequencer to control, for example, the decay of the envelope. Right, so we can do something like this. Maybe add more release. Right. Right, so we have some variation on the envelope as well. We can use this also to modulate the filter. Right, and we can use the envelope itself also to control the density. Right, so we have another layer of complexity. Let's even make this a bit more interesting by sending this through plateau. Of course, plateau, the lovely reverb from Valley. Right, we will set a nice long reverb. Lots of decay, no modulation, no filtering, or maybe you know what, a bit filtering for the lows. Right, maybe even a longer or bigger size. Right, something like this. And now here we have the clear function. I do this all the time. If I trigger this, right, basically it will clear the reverb. And like this we can create a gated reverb. So if I use, for example, the sequence from the bass, right, we have even more variation. It's breathing a bit. Right, I will name these hats. Right? Okay, now let's go back to the first sequence. I want to change it even more and create even more variation. So now we can manipulate the phasor signal with the sub, let me put this here, it's called the sub-step shaper. Right, again, it's another module in this collection. I will send the phasor first of all through this module, right, and then back to the sequencer. We can also have a look on the scope, how it will look like. For now, again, we still have the phasor signal. We have a raising ramp that will scan from step 1 to step 16, right, and then back again, jumping directly to step 1. Right, but we have here a few ways of processing the phasor signal, and again by that change the way the sequence runs. So for example, now it's set, we have a few modes here, it's set here to curve. Right, if I change the shape, right, again it will change the scanning of the sequencer. You can see the shape here on the scope. Right, we can also split it into a few different steps. So if I split this in 2, for example, we will have 2 curves, so 1 to 8 and then 9 to 16, right, which can also be interesting. But I will go with triangle, right, reset the shape and have it again at step of 2. So now have a look at the shape we are getting. Now the sequencer runs forward and backward. And again, this will happen while it's split in 2. Right, so again, now we have a bit more movement, a bit more variation. Right, now it's a bit too much for what's going on here, and we can add some space to this by utilizing the run input. So with this we can add, sort of gate the sequence. If I use another chances, for example, right? And I'm going to trigger this with the pulses output of the phaser generator, right? We have pulses output, right? It will output a pulse with each end of cycle, but we can change how many per cycle, how many pulses. If I change this to 2, right now it will output 2 pulses each cycle, right? And this we can use to gate the sequence. Right? And now we can use the chance control, the probability control as a performative tool. All the way to the left, it will always trigger or gate the sequencer. All the way to the right, we will have no gates. And then everywhere in between, we have some variation. We can use this as a performative tool to add and remove density, complexity, intensity, and so on. Right, let's mute everything. And now we will add another voice. This will be somewhat a simple, dark kick drum with Trummor 2. Right, again, I will use the pulses output from the phaser generator to trigger it or to gate it. Right, and I will send it through some delay with Prince of Perception from Flag. Right, I can also use the pulses to sync the delay. Let's listen to this already. Right, so now the delay is synced. We can use, for example, a 16th dotted delay. Right, to get a nice rhythm, I can remove some of the lower frequencies from the wet signal. Right. Add ducking, so the incoming signal, the kick, will duck the wet signal. Let's add some feedback. Right, something like this. On Trummor itself, we can take the bend a bit down, so it's a bit darker. Right, bring up the shaper. Right, let's unmute everything and set the levels a bit. I will call this kick. Right, maybe make this a bit louder. Right, something like this. Right, now before we add another voice, let's duck some of the voices with the kick drum. So Trummor 2, I can show you this also on the scope. It has an envelope output. The kick section or the oscillator section has an envelope output. It will output the amplitude envelope of the kick drum. If we invert this, and for this I will use the CV mix, right? If we invert this signal, right, just open it all the way to the left. Now we get the inverted amplitude or amp envelope. So we invert it and we offset it all the way up with the second channel. So now it will start at 10 volts or at maximum, and with each kick, if I remove the original one, with each kick the volume will go down. We can use this as a ducking envelope to duck, for example, the sequence just through the volume control, the bass and the delay. Right, so now we have some sort of pumping. Maybe on the delay, we can add a bit more feedback. Right. So now we have a bit more space for the kick drum. Okay, let's add another percussive voice. Let me solo this next channel. Right, I will use again another sequencer, in this case again another 32 steps one. Right, I will drive it with the same phaser. Right, in this case we will use Trummor 1, so the original Trummor module. Right, I will use the gates again to gate it. This will go to this channel on the mixer. Right, I will take down the oscillator section all the way, so that, we will not hear the oscillator section, just the noise section. Right, take the level a bit up. I will set the sequencer to have 20 steps. So again, we get a poly rhythm. Activate steps, let's say 5, 11, and 15. Right, so this will give us a nice rhythm. We can use again the sequencer itself to change the decay. I just set it here to decay. Right, maybe make it a bit more snappy. Right, and now let's have something like this. So step 11 is a bit longer. Let's add some decimate. This will add a sample rate reduction. Change the tone so it's brighter. Right, let's unmute it. Call this snare. Right, maybe add just a tiny bit of reverb. Right, something like this. Right, and now let's quickly add another voice, a percussive FM voice. We will use 2 Pony VCOs, also from the VCO, and Rampage in between. Opalach. Right, and Rampage. We will use the envelopes of Rampage to control. If I zoom in a bit, you know what, let's solo this also just a second, just so we can listen to everything nicely. I will use the envelopes of Rampage to open the built-in VCAs on the Pony VCOs. Right, to trigger them, to sequence them, we will use another module in this collection. This is called the Phasor Rhythm Group. Right, again, it's another module in this collection. It's great for creating polyrhythms. Basically, we have 3 groups of triggers that we can divide and create unique rhythms. So let's again drive this with the main Phasor. And again, please experiment with all sorts of shapes of the Phasor signal. As you saw before, we can manipulate the shape, something like the substep shaper, but you can use all sorts of modules to create and generate your own unique Phasor signals. Right, so now we will use the main output here, the triggers, to trigger one section of the Rampage. Let's listen to this also. Right? It will sound like this. Right, we can make it nice and snappy by changing the range here to fast. Oh yeah. Right, so now the main steps, this is set to 16, right? If I change this to 5, right, again, at the same time, the other sequencers are sequencing or scanning through 16 steps. This will scan through 5. So again, we get a nice polyrhythm. I will change the main group to 3. Right, and use this to trigger the second channel of Rampage. So this group is divided into 3 to fit inside the 5. You will hear this in a second. This Pony VCO, the second one, will modulate the frequency of the first one. Maybe I will take the main one an octave down just to create something a bit more woody. Make this also snappy. Right, so now you can hear both rhythms. We have the rhythm of 5 and the rhythm of 3 inside the 5. Right? Make this a bit brighter, maybe use a triangle wave. No, I like the sine wave actually. Right, let's again send this through a delay with Prince of Perception. Right, again, we can sync it with the triggers or the pulses from the Phasor generator. Right, and maybe change this to 16th notes. Right, and now Prince of Perception has, again, the ducking feature, but here down we have an input. This is not a CV input. I mean, it is CV, everything is voltage, but this is an audio input that we can use with external signals, something like the kick drum. So we can use the kick drum to duck the wet signal of the delay. right? If we turn it all the way up, a bit more mix, a bit more feedback, right? So now the kick drum adds also rhythm to this voice, right? Let's unmute everything, call this Pony, add some reverb. Just another interesting percussive voice, just an excuse for me to show you also this module, the rhythm group, right? We can add also panning modulation with an LFO. I will use the LFO from Bog Audio. This will go directly to the panning modulation CV input, right? Maybe make this a bit quicker, right? Again, just to add a bit more variation. Now I'm going to add character to everything with distortion. I'm going to use the distortion from Surge. I'm just going to send the output, the main output, through the distortion because I like distortion and it's fun. Turn off the pre-EQ, the post-EQ we can turn all the way up, the high cut. Let's go with OJD, add drive, oh yes, oh yeah, add feedback. Oh yes, and now we can use the high cut as a performative tool. Right? Something like this. I'm going to play with this a bit. I hope you will stick to this little performance. And I hope you also enjoy this video. Come join us on Patreon. Thank you again for watching. Thank you HetrickCV for this lovely collection. Cheers!